I'm going to give everybody a little bit of time to join. I know that sometimes there's a delay with letting people into the room for these webinars, especially with the number of people that we have had attend recently. So those numbers are still climbing. You guys are popular. Give it just a little bit longer. Okay, so welcome everybody to our third All Rise programming with the Dallas Association of Young Lawyers. Today's topic is going to be on substance abuse, both inside and outside the legal profession. And we're also going to talk a little bit about traumas and micro traumas and some of the underlying things that we see in that area. So thank you everyone for joining us. I have the pleasure of introducing our esteemed panelists today. So first we have Judge Tiffany Hartling of the 442nd District Court of Denton County, Texas. She's also the creator of specialized drug courts in Denton County that take on specific cases with substance abuse issues in kind of the CPS arena, so we can have more of a specialized approach for those families and children in particular. We also have Carrie Stitt, who is a licensed professional counselor, and she's also CEO of this amazing nonprofit called Youth 180 that really provides wraparound services for children with issues of substance abuse in their lives, as well as the families. So they're really treating the entire family in these situations. We also have Michael Ritter, who is our 2022 president of the Texas Young Lawyers Association. Thank you so much for joining us, Michael. And then we have Brian Cuban, who is a well-known mental health advocate and author of The Addicted Lawyer. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Sherry just put the course number in the chat since we are approved for ethics credit. And that course number is 174131287. So make sure to report that. And if anyone has any questions during the presentation, feel free to put that in the chat and I'll be happy to direct those questions to our panelists and make sure that hopefully those get answered. So let's start off today's conversation with substance abuse, generally speaking, and just reminding people that we're not alone in this struggle that we see far too often. So Carrie, I really want to start with you as the mental health professional in this. Can you just generally explain to our audience what is substance abuse, and is it typically tied to another health component, mental health component in your experience?
Yeah, so first of all, let me say thank you so much for having me be a part of this panel. I am extremely honored to be sitting alongside Brian and Michael and Judge Hartling. So thank you so much. But yes, in our experience and in my personal experience working with people who have been diagnosed with addiction issues, it is actually a response to something and not necessarily the root cause of maybe what is going on in that person's life. A lot of times as well, there are co-occurring disorders such as some mental health concerns. In my experience, it has primarily been in a response to a traumatic event that may have happened in their lives. And let me break down traumatic event. I'm not talking about a traumatic event like a natural disaster or something like that. When I'm talking about a traumatic event, I'm typically talking about an adverse experience. And a lot of times those tend to happen in childhood. And so we could be talking about something like growing up in a household where there's domestic violence, growing up with a parent or caregiver that could have been struggling with mental health concerns, being involved in the juvenile justice system can also be a traumatic event. And it could also be what we call in the mental health field micro traumas. It could be a series of smaller traumatic events. Bullying could be a micro trauma if it's substantial and long term. And so a lot of times what happens from those traumatic events, we establish coping skills that may not be the most healthiest for us. And so we might be experiencing some anxiety, some depression as a result of those traumas or micro traumas that we experience. And we don't identify those as anxiety. We identify just the feeling. And so we seek out things to help negate or cope with those feelings that we're having. And so a lot of times we will turn to substances to help us cope with those things. And so that's really what we have been seeing. And so I want to be clear in saying that in our experience and in my personal experience, I don't see people waking up in the morning and making just a decision to say, okay, I'm going to, turn to cocaine. And that's a decision that they're saying, I'm going to turn to cocaine in order to deal with this, this, and this. There's a book out there that's called The Body Keeps the Score. And if you haven't read that, the title says it all, and in which our body does keep the score, and it keeps the score internally, and then externally is how it releases the score. So I do want to say that I want to change that narrative around what substance abuse and misuse really is.
And I think based on everything that you're saying with micro traumas and the underlying mental health component, it's no secret that attorneys in particular have a predisposition to suffer from substance abuse, anxiety, depression, all of those things. And in fact, the ABA reports that almost 21% of attorneys are suffering from addiction in some form, and that our profession has the highest rate of any profession for alcoholism and substance abuse. Now, these numbers are from 2018. And so unfortunately, I can only imagine that based on what we've experienced the last year and a half, that those numbers have likely gone up as people have had to cope with this new world and this new environment that we're living in. And so I really want to hear from Michael about your experience with substance abuse or misuse, whichever term that you feel most comfortable using in this situation. And, how did you turn it around? How did you kind of find order in the chaos for yourself, and obviously get to the position that you are now president of the Young Lawyers of our entire state?
Yay. Those are some great questions and tough questions, Whitney, and I appreciate you asking them and having me here today. It's an honor to be on this panel with these other speakers, just talking from my own experience and addressing it in terms of what it looked like, how I got there, and how I got out of that situation, how I addressed my substance abuse issues. When I was a younger lawyer, I was having a difficult time coping with the stresses of the profession and the expectations I'd placed on myself. Growing up, I had several jobs, part-time jobs, but law school was the first professional experience that I had. But I'd primarily been a student through college and law school. My first year of law school, my second year of law school was 2008. There was the market crash, the worsening economic situation, and it was like there were no jobs available. And it was really, I think, to go back to Carrie's point, it was a traumatic time for me because I was expecting there to be this particular path that was there that was no longer there. So I had always struggled with the stress of trying to find a job and making sense out of this very big decision I made to go to law school. So I clerked for a couple of years, and then I started working at the Attorney General's office. And it seemed that every year that I was in the practice of law, I was making less money. I was more stressed. I was getting further away from what it is that I wanted to do. One of my outlets was hanging out with friends and eating and drinking as a release. And over time, I started to rely more heavily on eating and drinking to cope with what I thought was a failure on my part. And applying for jobs and not getting an interview or interviewing and not getting an offer, it kind of made me feel like I was stuck. And so what it looked like sort of towards the time that I realized I had a problem was I was binge eating and binge drinking pretty much every single day to induce unconsciousness so I wouldn't have to deal with these feelings that I was having, because I thought it was one of the only ways to deal with it. During that time, I woke up pretty much every single morning thinking about suicide. And to Carrie's point, it's not that someone wakes up in the morning and says, I'm going to binge eat today or binge drink today. It was more of a, well, I don't want to kill myself, and that seems the only other way out. So I'm just going to not be conscious for it, and I'm just going to have a good time, and I'm going to go to work, and then when I leave work, I'm just going to eat and drink until I fall asleep. And it started to come to breaking point for me, and that my friends and my family was noticing it, and they expressed concerns about it. My mom actually tried to have me committed, and I hadn't gotten to that point. Whenever I was interviewed, they were like, "This isn't the right fit for me," but I saw the impact that it had on my mother. And I realized I needed to figure out a better solution to my issues. So I just started to go to therapy, and that really helped. I was asked to resign from my job, which at the time I was like, how could I have gotten like this far in my career to go like get worse and worse every single year, and then now I'm being asked to resign from the Attorney General's office because I can't even do the basic task of being a lawyer. But it was really those significant events that, looking back at it in retrospect, I'm so glad that my mom made that mistake to think that I was worse off than I was, probably still in a bad situation, and that the Attorney General's office, the division chief who saw that I had problems, that was actually a really, really good thing for me, because a lot of the stress I was facing was from those circumstances. And that kind of wrapped up like what I was going through, and sort of how I progressed through it.
Thank you so much for sharing that with everyone, Michael. I know that it's hard reflecting and looking back on it, but I think it's so beneficial for people to see someone who is successful as you are that has overcome these issues. And Judge Hartling, I'm curious from your perspective as being someone in a position of authority, being someone who's on the bench and who not only has experience with these drug courts, but who also obviously has experience with lawyers day in and day out appearing in front of you. How do you see substance abuse manifest in the courtroom, and how do you address it if you have a concern?
Well, first, I want to say that one of the things as attorneys, we deal, or when I was on that side of the bench, all you deal with is people's problems all day long. And so it is very difficult once you deal with somebody else's problems all day long to then deal with your own problems. And so I see, and I've seen over the years, I've been practicing for 30 years, that, we as lawyers don't deal with things as well as we should. And I've seen that, we have a lot that have substance abuse issues. And so on the bench, the way that we see it is my coordinator is very good. We have about 1,500 cases, but we try to manage those cases very well. And so we keep up with everything. And, we have in Denton County, it's a little bit smaller community. So we know when, all right, they're not returning my coordinator's emails, they're showing up late for court, or they're missing court appearances and they hadn't done that in the past. And so at that point, we know, okay, there may be an issue here. And so we try to talk to them and say, hey, is there something going on? Are you okay? Is there something we can help you with? And try to reach out to them to see if there's anything going on. And then I think that since I do have the drug court, attorneys feel comfortable coming and talking to me. We've had instances where an attorney appeared in somebody else's court and they thought they were drunk, and the judge didn't notice, but the person standing next to them could smell the alcohol on them, and they came to me. And so, I think in Denton County, we have people that that we know that they can go to and try to get help. And so at that point, then we try to call them in and talk to them, because we can't have people appearing impaired in our courtrooms, and try to get them help. I will tell anybody that and I've had people come in and say, look, I'm going through some difficult times right now. I can't do this. And so we try to pair them with other attorneys that have gone through similar situations, and then try to make sure that we get their cases where they're not having to deal with their docket and deal with their personal issues at the same time. So, and I just think in the legal community, we need to watch out for each other. If you notice that your friend who normally is on time to court and is not on time to court, or they've had a significant other die, or a parent die, or somebody that's going through health issues and they're slowly slipping, that can be indications that they are not dealing with it the way that they should be dealing with it. And so I just think we need to keep and talk to people and reach out. And I know it's harder with everybody doing it through Zoom. I know that we've lost track of people, and it's hard to really see how people are doing when they're stuck in their homes. But as a legal community, I would just encourage everyone to not hesitate if you think something's wrong, and trying to talk to people to work through those issues.
And I think on one of our previous calls, I wrote this down, Judge Hartling, and I like it, that you quoted, we have to check on each other, that when we hold each other accountable and when we provide support to each other, sometimes that can be the most life-changing thing for anyone, which really is the purpose of these webinars, is for people to realize that there are resources out there, there are people to talk to, and there are people who have gone through similar experiences. So thank you for just reminding everyone that it's up to us to look out for each other. I know that we're in such a obviously litigious field that involves conflict, but at the end of the day, we're all still humans, and we need to make sure that each of us are okay.
Well, and one of the things I will always try to communicate to people, our legal cases are our projects. They're not our personal problems. And what happens a lot of times is attorneys, personalize their clients' problems and cross that line. And so you need to keep that barrier. Okay, this is a project. I didn't make these decisions for this person to get in here. I'm going to help them get out, but I'm not going to internalize it, and I'm not going to make it my problem. Because too much, what needs to happen is you need to come in, if you're doing it in the courtroom, you need to have a good adversary, have a great, presentation of the case. And then the attorney should be able to walk out of the courtroom and shake hands, or go have, lunch or coffee or whatever, and still be okay. And what I'm seeing now is so many attorneys have really taken it on as their problems, that they are combating the other attorney in really aggressive ways that are more where they're taking it personally what the other person is doing, and not drawing that line between the project and the problem. And I think that creates more problems too for the attorney, but also for the clients, because now you're not getting the objective advice that they sought to get. When you cross that line and it becomes your problem, you've lost objectivity, and you're not as good of an advocate for that person. Because sometimes you have to tell your client, look, your position's unreasonable. Okay. And if you don't have the ability to tell them that their position's unreasonable, and you just get in there and keep fighting, that creates more issues too. But I think I went off on a tangent. So
no, I appreciate that, especially as someone who practices family law. It's so nice to be reminded and hear that I can't carry the weight of all my clients' problems, that my job is as an advocate and not just an emotional punching bag, and that you have to draw that line. I think that it's so important for people to remember that. I'm glad you brought it up. All right, so Brian, I would love for you to share with the audience your personal experience with substance abuse, and how you finally decided to get help and now be in a position where you're a motivational speaker and a recognized author. Can you tell the audience a little bit about what you went
Absolutely.
through?
And just a quick follow-up on her honors, what she said about trauma. I talked to a lot of lawyers who have allowed their clients' trauma to become theirs, and they take it home, and then they can no longer differentiate between their trauma and their client's trauma, and it all ends up the same in how it manifests in substance use or depression and things like that. So it's very important to be able to step back. For me, a lot of my issues fall in line with what Carrie has talked about. My life is basically an accumulation of traumatic snapshots that I established a baseline for as a teenager, and that baseline of coping never changed. It only got worse. I was a heavy child. I was trending on obese. I was bullied severely. I was even physically assaulted over my weight. I was pantsed. I had a very difficult fat shaming relationship with my mother. And I don't blame my mother for those things. She had a difficult relationship with her mother, who had the same mentally abusive relationship with her mother. Parents don't cause eating disorders. Parents don't cause addiction. There's a difference between cause and correlation. So I don't want anyone to think that I blame my mother for my issues. I don't. But it all manifested itself as when I went into Penn State, these traumas as an eating disorder. I became anorexic, then bulimic. I began using alcohol to cope as a freshman at Penn State, as a law student at Pitt. When I moved to Dallas in 1987, I transitioned to cocaine. I tried cocaine, and then it became Katie, bar the door. I failed the bar exam twice as a result of drug and alcohol issues. The first time I took the Texas bar exam in a flea bag motel in Fort Worth, my study aids the weekend before the exam were cocaine, whiskey, and a liter of tab and some Barbary books I had borrowed that day. So as you might imagine, I failed. I went to jail, 2 trips to a psychiatric hospital, the first in 2005 after a near suicide attempt, where my brothers came into my room and there was an .45 automatic on my nightstand, 3 failed marriages, 1 more, I get a free set of steak knives, and all of this, and then finally recovery in 2007. And in between all of that, I was doing cocaine in the George Allen courthouse. I was doing cocaine in the federal courthouse. I was showing up to hearings in the morning under the influence of Xanax and sometimes still residual cocaine. And so did I know this was wrong? Of course I knew. Did I know I could run into licensure issues? Of course I knew. Did I know I could go to jail? Of course I knew. I went to jail. I knew that. I wasn't stupid. But what's the definition of addiction? Obsessive compulsive substance seeking in the face of known consequences. We know what the consequences are, but addiction has a way of rewiring the brain. My moment of truth, what I call my tipping point, my recovery tipping point, I don't like rock bottom because it assumes that the worst has to happen for us to recover. The goal should be to catch our colleagues at the highest point before there's a problem. Was the Easter weekend 2007, after my wife, now my girlfriend at that time, now my wife, had gone away for the weekend. I went out. The next thing I knew, it was 2 days later, she was staring down at me, and she had just moved in with me. There was cocaine everywhere. 2 days later, I think I said to her, there was cocaine everywhere. There was Xanax strewn out. There were bottles of wine. I think she was trying to figure out if she walked in the right house. I was trying to figure out what lie I could tell to explain this law and order orgy of evidence that I might not be the person I claim to be. And we went back to the psychiatric hospital for the second time. And standing in that parking lot, Whitney, a couple things occurred to me. One, that she was going to leave. I'd leave. She actually stood by me, and we've now been married going on 5 years. So not all relationships will survive that, but ours was able to because I did the work and rebuilt the broken trust. I thought about the fact that there probably wouldn't be a third trip back to that hospital, Green Oaks, because I'd be dead. And I thought something my father had said to my 2 brothers and I growing up. My father, who was the middle of 3 boys like me, fought in the Pacific, Korean War, old school, greatest generation. He said, guys, wherever you go in life, whatever happens, always check on your brother. Always tell your brother you love him. And I thought hard about that. And my father had that relationship with his brothers, and he was passing down that gift of family, which is a privilege because so many don't have that. and I feel privileged to have it. And I didn't want to lose my family, and I wouldn't lose their love, but family's distance, right? They get frustrated. I was no longer seeing my nieces and nephews. I was no longer seeing my father because I was always drunk, high, or recovering from one of the two. And I wasn't ready to lose my family. And I think that was really the moment that I finally said, okay, this is it. This is enough. So the next day I walked into my psychiatrist's office, who I've been lying to, getting my antidepressants while I'm also doing blow and drinking. That works out well. And why would you lie to your psychiatrist? You're there to share. Well, shame knows no hourly rate. I was ashamed. And that is not unusual for people to lie to their treatment providers. But I finally got vulnerable, something lawyers have a very difficult time with. I allowed myself to get vulnerable because we're trained to take advantage of it, not allow ourselves to express it to help ourselves. And so he suggested only two things. I was only given two options: residential treatment or 12-step. And for those who don't know, the most well-known of the 12 steps is AA, but there are others. And I refused to go to residential treatment because I was much too important a lawyer to go to residential treatment, even though I had no clients left. My career had crashed. And so I chose 12-step. And I even resisted 12-step, Whitney. I said to him, I remember it, I'm not going to 12-step. They smoke out there. Secondhand smoke will kill you, doctor, right? There's always a reason not to recover. But I walked into the room of 12-step April 8th. And sitting in that room, I didn't know if I was a quote unquote alcoholic. And I put it in quotes because that's a label. The term is alcohol use disorder, the diagnosis. And I didn't know if I was that, but here's what I knew. Here's what I wanted the first day of recovery. If sitting in that room would allow me to walk to the mirror in my bathroom, birthday suit naked, for the first time in my life, look myself in the eye and love myself. For the first time in my life, in my 40s, for the first time, I would sit in that room. In addition to a lot of therapy to deal with my body image issues and continuing to sit in that room, I have over 14 years of recovery today, long-term recovery.
That's such an incredible story, Brian. And I mean, obviously it's inspiring to so many people that still listen to you speak and want to read your book and remind themselves that recovery is possible. And so I'm going to go a little off the cuff here because I keep hearing people talking about having some kind of accountability with their peers or checking on each other and realizing that, okay, check in on your brother, make sure that you're okay. And so, Carrie, do you have any kind of practical tips for us attorneys, colleagues, judges? How do we create a safe space to have these sort of discussions with each other?
Yeah, well, the first I would say is by attending talks like this and hearing firsthand other people's stories, because it's hard to not understand something when you're up close to it. Okay, it's really easy to pass judgment and judge and, kind of point fingers when, we're really distant from it and we don't have a clear understanding of what is actually happening with somebody. So hearing Michael and Brian talk about and be so candid about their stories just really tells me that they feel like this is a safe space for them to share, that they have done a lot of work around the vulnerability aspect of sharing their story. And so the opposite of vulnerability is fear. A lot of times, fear of judgment, fear of, losing your license. And the same thing, as I'm hearing you all talk as attorneys and practicing lawyers, a lot of the same premises are true for therapists and counselors. We hear people's problems all day long. And we, absorb all that. We're taught to do that, in school to a certain extent. But how do we take care of ourselves? And how do we take care of each other? I actually supervise other clinical students' licenses. And one of the things that I encourage them to do is to stay in therapy while they are seeing clients, because it's an outside perspective to be able to check. It's that extra backstop, if you will, of knowing when you have gotten too involved in things. Also, role modeling exactly what you want other people to do. So me, I struggle with severe anxiety, and I have struggled with anxiety my entire life. I can remember as a child, I would hear the news and break out in hives. And, my parents would take me to the doctor and they're like, there's nothing wrong with her other than, at the time we didn't know that it was anxiety. But as I've gotten older and the more further up the career ladder, if you will, the more stressful things become. And in the world of attorneys, it's attorneys and lawyers where it is a very generational profession. A lot of times, if your dad was a doctor, there's somebody in the family, one of his children becomes a doctor. And the same thing with lawyers. And, it's just a generationally passed down profession. There's a lot of pride taken in it. And so with that comes a lot of stress to measure up, to be, to follow in your predecessor's footsteps, and not just follow, but then to exceed what came before you. But I keep in my office, and I realize that I'm a therapist, but I also, when I talk with other people, I actually have on my finger right now a little, it's like a fidget toy kind of thing, but I run it over my finger because I get such anxiety. But I do this even when I'm in meetings, even when I'm, out in the public, because there's no shame in it. And I want people that show up around me to feel comfortable to say, hey, I'm having an anxious, moment, or I'm feeling, this way. I want people to see me role modeling what I want them to do should they need to. I actually also have a little tiny sand tray right next to me. I keep it on my desk. And when I meet with people, you'll be so surprised. Even people who are not, therapists will come in and just dig in. Will just be running their hands through it. And as we're talking about things that are very, could be stressful, you'll see them just really, grabbing the sand. But having things like that and role modeling that it's a safe space for people to show up who they are around you will do wonders for people. And what that will do is it will also encourage them to do the same thing with other people. If they feel comfortable showing up as who they are and whatever it is that day that they're carrying with them, they'll take that with them. So, be vulnerable with each other as much as you can, and create those safe spaces for people. Hold that space for people. And so those are the real tangible ways that I think that we can kind of encourage each other and, just create those safe spaces.
Thank you for that, Carrie. And speaking of safe spaces, Judge Hartling, I would love to hear your perspective as a judge that if a lawyer is experiencing substance abuse, what kind of solutions or help are you able to offer being in the position that you are from the bench?
Well, one, we have great treatment providers, and the reason that I have that in those contacts is because I've established the family drug court. And so if I hadn't established that and met with the people and work with treatment providers for substance abuse on a close basis, I wouldn't have known that they existed or how to communicate. And it's very easy now, I think, because I have spoken so much in our community regarding the issues that we have in the CPS system with people having drug use, that they know that I am familiar with it. I understand. While I don't have the experience that some of the panel members have, I can put people in contact with treatment providers who have gone in, and the main one we use, I mean, he's been sober for 25 years. So where people wouldn't maybe feel comfortable from talking to me, he seems to be able to get people to open up really well. And so as attorneys, what you have to really understand is that if you're suffering from substance abuse, yes, in other professions, you can just harm yourself and the family and the close people around you. The problem was you're a lawyer, you don't just harm you and your family, which I'm not saying that that's okay, but I'm saying the impact is so much greater because you're going to impact, if you have 50 clients, you impact them and their cases and sometimes their livelihood and all of that. And so we need to come in and basically say, okay, I see there's a problem. And if you recognize that, you should go to the courts. Surely in Dallas, I don't know very many of the judges there, but I know that they probably would want to know and help you in that situation. And so I've had several attorneys just come in and say, you know, I missed court the other day. And I'm like, I understand. We were, you know, I'm the one calling you because I don't let people just miss. I usually seek them out and call them and ask them where they are and what's going on. And so when they come in, they need to come in and tell me, hey, I've got issues. And I've had several come in and say, look, I'm going through some mental health issues. I'm going through some substance abuse issues. And we're like, okay, let me get you, we have mentors in Denton County. Let me get you connected with someone so that you can help, they can help you work through this. We can help somebody come in and help you with your cases. So that's the biggest thing is communication. But I know that from Michael and Brian's perspective, they're probably like, that was the last thing I wanted to do was go talk to a judge and admit that I had a problem when I couldn't admit it to myself. And so that's why, you know, I try to reach out if I see that there's issues coming so that we can help with that. And there is TLAP. I mean, if you see somebody, you can call for TLAP. We kind of have our local TLAP because I think people are worried about calling TLAP, and I've had to do that. And my understanding is TLAP will call and they'll say that I'm okay. And then we still have to come around and work with them again. And I'm sure TLAP works sometimes, but I would just say out there, in my perspective, if I talk to them once and it doesn't work, or if they come and talk to me, that's a good sign because then they know there's an issue. But sometimes I have to talk to them and then we have to get somebody else to talk to them a different route. And then sometimes I've got to call my treatment provider and say, hey, you have a relationship with this person. Would you feel comfortable reaching out? And, you know, so I would just say, don't give up. You know I had said before, you need to ask people if they're okay. And I think Brian says I should ask something else. Ask how they're doing. Ask how they're doing instead of asking if they're okay. But ask how they're doing. And if they say fine, and you know they're not fine, sometimes you don't need to accept that. You need to make sure that you keep trying to figure out because, you know, people that have substance abuses sometimes are hard-headed. And so we just have to be vigilant in trying to help them. And then too, I want to protect their law license, you know, because when they get sober, we want them to have a career to come back to. And so the goal is to try to reach them at the high level, just like Brian said, not at the low level, because if we reach them at the low level, they may have damaged so many clients that they're not ever going to get their license back. So you try to help them at the higher level so that they can get help and then they still have a great career to come back to.
And I know that you touched on this a little bit, Judge, about the Texas Lawyers Assistance Program, TLAP. But I just wanted to remind our audience that this program is available to all the lawyers in the state of Texas. We actually have a disciplinary rule that allows us as attorneys to report to TLAP rather than a disciplinary board if if an attorney is experiencing or showcasing misconduct. So if they're not fulfilling their requirement of exercising competent and diligent representation of their client, rather than making a bar complaint, our disciplinary rules allow you to instead report to TLAP, which is a confidential agency that is aimed at really rehabilitation and trying to figure out the cause and provide support to that individual. And so I hear so many young lawyers that don't even know what TLAP is, but it is this incredible kind of sidearm of the bar that not only can help and investigate situations where there may be substance abuse or other underlying mental health issues, but also, there are grants available for inpatient treatment that if you can't afford an InterHealth, if you can't afford an Innovations 360 or one of these kind of premier programs, there are grants available to help you get whatever help you need, despite what the finances may be. And so another one of our disciplinary rules obviously requires keeping clients informed. And so, Michael, I know that you worked with the Attorney General's office, and I know that you had much more contact with your supervisor, but in your opinion, do you believe that your substance abuse or your eating disorders impacted your communications with supervisors or other people in the legal field? And did it ever create issues of avoidance for you?
Yes, absolutely. Substance abuse was for me avoidance itself. And then it was the effects of substance abuse that kind of compounded the problem, became like this cycle where it was like I didn't want to confront or deal with what I was going through. So I was binge eating and binge drinking. And then the effects of that binge eating and binge drinking made me want to avoid things even more. One, I had gained a lot of weight, so I didn't feel like going out and seeing my friends or being social, so I isolated more. At work, I didn't want anybody to notice I was hungover or was having a hard time functioning, so I just stayed away from my supervisor. And it just kind of impaired me generally to the point I wasn't communicating with my supervisor about the cases I had, and working on a team of people where we all had our own cases. It was a situation where I ended up, going to Judge Hartley Point. I missed a hearing, and no judge called me and asked, is everything okay? I wish I had that kind of relationship with the judge. And so I do think that part of the problem for me, I think a lot of people, is that admitting you have a problem, raises this ethical question that if you admit it, sometimes it violates disciplinary rules, and sometimes it violates the penal code, and it's like admitting that you have a problem is scary because you think you can lose your license, you could go to jail, and what if people know there's this problem. But I do think that one of the solutions to those communication issues is really having those safe spaces in a community. And sometimes that community is your immediate family. Sometimes it's, a judge who has made themselves available. And sometimes it's the Young Lawyers Associations putting on programs like this, talking about modeling behavior. Going to Carrie's point, I kind of just got reconnected to my community and my family. And that's what I felt really helped me have the confidence that I needed to correct some of those underlying issues and have that confidence in being connected with people. But substance abuse can be used to avoid people, which I think disconnects us even more, which compounds the issues of avoidance and can create a lot of ethical problems of communicating reasonably and diligently with clients and supervisors and teammates. And it's probably the better approach to nip it in the bud. As Brian was saying, it's the very top rather than a rock bottom.
And Brian, I know that you had mentioned in one of our conversations about meeting people where they are, that you're a big believer in figuring out where that individual who's struggling is at and how to meet them there. What advice do you have for young lawyers who may be struggling with substance abuse or addiction in one form or another?
My advice is that it's okay to be ashamed. Okay, shame. We hear all the time, don't be ashamed, don't be ashamed. I said, wait a minute, shame is a natural human response to stigmatized issues. And substance use disorder and problematic drinking are very stigmatized issues. Lawyers deal with two layers of stigma. We have the societal stigma, where society says, just stop. What's the problem? Your family saying, just stop, I don't get it. And saying there must be something wrong with you because you can't stop, even though we know the brain gets rewired. And then you have the second layer of stigma that adds a second layer of shame, where the legal profession puts a whole different spin on it, right? You worried about your job, you're worried about not making partner and all these different things. You're worried about your license. And so we have all of this self-consuming shame. And I tell them, that's okay. This is your body's normal response. So what are we going to do now? How are you going to respond to that shame? Are you going to go this way where you have the security blanket and the learned behaviors? Or are we going to go to the right, another road that we can lay where you can peel back the layers in a safe space where someone like Carrie, and we can allow yourself to cry, allow yourself to feel the shame, allow yourself to peel back all the layers to whatever the trauma is, or whatever is, whatever the security blanket is, and allow yourself to redefine, to rebuild, and to become, and to allow yourself to once again advance in your career and as a person. And I don't just look at what someone's path is. Mine is abstinence, right? For me, there was no such thing as a line of Coke without drinking, and there was no such thing as drinking without many lines of Coke. But there are many different pathways to recover. With opioids, we see people with harm reduction, with Suboxone, and with methadone, and there's no shame in any of that. But I want to know, how's your life? How are you doing at work? How are you doing with your spouse? How are you doing with your children? There are so many different roads to look at and prongs of recovery than just, are you abstinence? And because I'm not abstinent, because I relapsed, I'm ashamed. Let's talk about the whole person. Let's meet the person where they are.
Thank you, Brian. And obviously we're living in such a crazy time with the pandemic, and the world may be reopening, maybe not. And I'm curious, Carrie, with the pandemic, are you seeing more substance abuse in your field than usual? And do you believe that it is often tied to a coping mechanism like we've been discussing today?
Yeah, we are definitely seeing a pretty large increase in the number of individuals who are seeking treatment services for either substance misuse and or mental health concerns. And what we're actually seeing is not just an uptick in people needing services, but to Brian's point, where we want to meet them at their highest functioning level, because COVID has created this environment where people now are more isolated, are now more secluded than ever. Our natural identifying systems, where we go out and we interact personally with individuals, and that's where we tend to pick up, and we can smell if somebody is there under the influence of alcohol or this and that. Those natural identifying systems are not there anymore. And all we're seeing is just a projection of somebody's face, like right now, on a screen. We're not having that physical interaction with individuals. And so what we're seeing is where people are further along in their addiction and or mental health crises. And so it's requiring greater forms of intervention where, can seem to be costly. And a lot of times when people come out of this isolation, is they're not ready to, a lot of times, seek full treatment. They are so committed now to utilizing the substances that they've sought out to help cope with the traumatic experiences, or this, and being in isolation is traumatic. We, by human nature, are wired for connection to other people. And so just the isolation component in itself is traumatic. And then you might add, whatever else has happened to that person. And so we are seeing a huge uptick in the number of people that are seeking services. And the last thing that I want to say, and this is kind of back to Brian's point, in that a lot of times what the first question that we ask, or that our family will ask, is, what's wrong with you? And I want to say that the question should not be what's wrong with you. The question should be, what happened to you? because that's really the root of where we need to get to be able to move forward. So to speak to Brian's point about, shame and things like that, yes, shame is a natural occurring emotion, and it, can be a great motivator of change. But we also don't want to compound shame with shame, right? So we also don't want to say what's wrong with you, because that's a shameful message that something is wrong with somebody. And there is nothing wrong. We all have an addiction to something. That is a natural occurring thing in life. And in order to in order to get over addiction, you have to replace it with something else. You can't remove something from somebody's life and not put something else back in there. And so that's why we want to change that, question from what's wrong with you to what happened.
And Judge Hartling, I know that as a litigator, most of my hearings right now have been virtually, have been primarily on Zoom. I can't recall. I know that Denton was reopening. I'm not sure if you're still conducting some things virtually, but in this climate, are you finding it a little harder to hold people accountable and to reach those individuals who may be experiencing issues right now?
We are fully in person because as long as we can, because I struggle with doing hearings via Zoom, because you can't hold anybody accountable. You just can't have people come in their bathrobes and, you try to be nice and say, are you wearing a bathrobe? And they're like, yes, I'm in my house. I can do what I want. And you're like, no, you're in my courtroom. So yes, I do. You lose accountability, but also we lose the interaction. And so on the screen, you can't tell as much as you can as if somebody's sitting in the courtroom with you. Two, people don't have to, it's just the getting up, showering, having to be someplace and be around people. I think it's easier for people not to do that. We kid, okay, you're going to have to put pants on to come to my courtroom. But I know that we have a significant more substance abuse and mental health going on, but we have not seen it yet because we haven't gotten enough people back into the courtroom. And so I am worried of what's going to happen later. And it is just so impersonal. And I think what's happened over the last year is that we are, one, with social media, two, we're all okay saying whatever we want, whenever we want, and there's no accountability for that. And so I think people have stopped reaching out, and I think that we've lost compassion. And what I would just, and for young lawyers, I think it's probably even more so because of the distance that you have when you're communicating with people through social media, that I just want to let you know, it's good to have compassion. It's good to reach out to somebody else. And while it would be easier to say, oh, I think such and such has got a problem and walk away, that's the easy part. But if you have true compassion for humanity and the people around you and our profession, you need to take that step, walk over to them, talk to them, try to figure out what's going on. And if you can't reach them, then make sure you take the next step and make sure that somebody else reaches them. Because I love our profession, but it's not just the stigmatism of, substance abuse with our profession. It's just the stigmatism of, I can't tell you how many times when I went to law school in the 90s that people are like, oh, why would you do that? Well, I love what I do. And I want people that are in the legal profession to love what they do. And so that we can, if you have an issue or you see somebody that does, just take that step and have that compassion. Because it could be you. You never know what's going to happen in life to you. I'm sure Brian never thought that he was going to end up where he ended up. He never had a plan to end up where he ended up. Michael did not have a plan of, okay, this is what I want to do. It's never a conscious decision. I think somebody said that, I'm going to end up and do here. It's just circumstances happen. We make a few bad decisions and then you end up where you are. So one, don't not make that step because you think it would never happen to you or that you're better than somebody else, because we're not. Just because I wear a black robe doesn't mean that I can't have issues that that I would make a bad decision sometimes. So just have that compassion.
Absolutely. And especially with colleagues and opposing counsel and people that we're interacting with, I try so hard to give people the benefit of the doubt and extend that olive branch, because what we do is so hard. And I want to switch gears a little bit to talk about in these last 10 minutes or so, how to be proactive and stay mentally healthy when somebody you know or you personally may be experiencing substance abuse. So one of the things that we've talked about, and I think everybody has touched on a bit, is counseling and working with mental health professionals. I've been working with Sherry Harris, our executive director for DAYL, on compiling a list of various mental health providers that either young lawyers have used and have personally experienced and have recommended. So that way we can distribute those lists to our membership. So if you need that list and you think that it could be beneficial, whether it's a psychiatrist, a nurse practitioner, or a counselor, please reach out to Sherry and I so we can share that with you, because these people have been vetted and recommended by other members in our association. Carrie, based on your professional expertise, especially in the counseling field, can you share some resources with our audience members who may be or who may know someone who's struggling with substance abuse and the issues that we've talked about today? Oh, you're on mute right now. I knew that I was going to have to say that at least one time in the presentation. I'm surprised this is the first time.
Yeah, it's not a Zoom meeting if you don't say that. So
Absolutely.
it's now a Zoom meeting. So what I would say is there are a lot of really qualified professionals out there. And there are several modalities, therapeutic treatment modalities, that are recognized as very successful forms of treatment for trauma. And so as you are looking and calling and asking about a therapist, there are two things that I would encourage you to ask as you are interviewing prospective therapists for yourself. One, I would ask if they specialize in trauma. And if the answer is yes, then I would ask, what treatment modality do you use? So there are two therapeutic treatment modalities that are known to be the most effective. The first one is trauma-focused CBT. CBT stands for cognitive behavioral therapy. The second one is EMDR, which is that is an acronym for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It has been around for a very long time, and there are a nice cohort of people who have been trained in it, and there are protocols that are specific to substance abuse and addiction. The great thing about EMDR is you do not have to retell your trauma to be able to experience success in that therapy. And so those are the two things that I would ask you as you're starting to, interview prospective therapists, is to make sure that they are knowledgeable in what it is that you're needing. There are therapists that are experienced in eating disorders. There are, therapists that are experienced with domestic violence, but it's just like a doctor. If you're having, an orthopedic issue, you're not going to go to a cancer doctor. It's the same thing with therapists. And so I did want to, leave you with that. And I am happy to help. Our nonprofit provides, we have licensed clinicians that provide EMDR and TFCBT at either low cost or no cost to the populations that we serve. And so if there's anything that Youth 180 can do, as Whitney said, we not only serve youth, but we believe that we need to support the entire system, not just the one person. And again, this goes back to, we don't want to shame individuals and saying that it's just one person's problem in the family. But we're happy to help and give you referrals as needed as well.
Thank you, Carrie. And I know that we're running short on time, but I did want to finish up with Brian and just see if you had some practical tips for dealing with the pressures that may lead to substance abuse, and how do you stay on that path of recovery and making sure that you're doing what's healthiest for yourself?
Well, I attend 12-step meetings still, now virtual, but I want to sort of pivot from it because this is important. I talk to lawyers all the time. We are as a profession, especially with alcohol, we are a very 12-step focused profession. This is what you're going to do, right? If you want to maintain your life, this is what you're going to do. There are many paths to recovery. I talk to lawyers all the time who just don't want to go to 12-step. They just do not, for various reasons. And we don't have to get into all the details. But for example, I've talked to lawyers in very rural communities where they're terrified that a jury's going to be on from 12-step. Someone's going to be there and recognize them. So they just won't go. There are other resources. We have Lawyers with Depression, where you can join that and have these meetings anonymously. We have In the Rooms, where you can find online. You can find Smart Recovery, Refuge Recovery. You can find mutual aid for pretty much anything: gambling addiction, sexual addiction, whatever your issue is, alcohol. It's kind of stigmatized in the legal profession, but again, if you're struggling with opioid addiction, there is harm reduction. I know lawyers on Suboxone, again, I know lawyers on methadone, and that's not abstinence, so everyone cringes. But again, we need to meet people where they are, and there are all of these other resources for you to take advantage of. Just, we need to be familiar with them when we want to support people. But I'm still in psychiatric counseling once a week, and I still go to 12, and I still do 12-step meetings.
Thank you, everyone, for sharing all of your personal experiences and also your professional experiences with our audience today. I know that I've gone a couple minutes over, so I want to be respectful of the rest of your day and your time, but thank you for everything that each of you is doing as a mental health advocate. And this video will be available on YouTube. And so if anyone wants to come back and look at it later or wasn't able to cue in today for the whole entire presentation, make sure to check out the Dallas Association of Young Lawyers YouTube page. And these All Rise presentations will all be available there. Thank you so much. I hope you all have a wonderful day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you for including me.
Thanks, Whitney.
Thanks.